I'd like to just start this session, Invest in Community, with just calling in a collective mindful moment, just a brief moment of silence for us to just kind of, you can close your eyes if you like, but to resource ourselves for the conversation. Just take a breath wherever you are, find yourself, and maybe we'll just do about 10 seconds or so. Inviting everyone to take a deep breath in. Maybe one more. Feel into your body, feel into your feet. All right. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this session, Invest in Community, and want to start with a few brief housekeeping details. I'm sure it looks like all of you are familiar with the chat box. Thanks, folks, already for modeling that. And just want to invite folks to share as you feel inspired where you're calling in from in the chat, and perhaps your intention for joining the session, and or at any point, any questions that you're holding or intentions for joining the session that panelists might be able to respond to when they share, or maybe answer in the chat while another panelist is speaking. So just to give folks a quick overview of the kind of flow for today's session, we're going to just do a quick round of introductions here, and then dive right into the topic and kind of explore the question of what's really alive in this topic for each of our panelists. We'll then we'll hopefully have about 15 minutes on the back end for audience Q&A, and we can bring you up on screen if you like for that. And then kind of 2-minute close for reflections and look to the next items on the schedule. So that's kind of the rundown. And just to quickly introduce this session. So the theme of this session is invest in the community, right? And there is a disconnect between mainstream capital markets and the value of BIPOC businesses. And the disconnection lies in equal parts bias and racism, as well as interest and intention. And investors might not truly know how to find them or plug these enterprises in a way that's financially sound, or maybe sometimes they feel like they're steering that interaction too much. And this begs the question, how can large-scale capital investment be balanced with a business-to-business approach so that funds aren't lost? What is the role of community capital in local investments? And so just to start off with some introductions, we're going to start off with our panelists for today are Brian Beckon, Titi, Ikhile, Nicole, Jarbo, and Trevor, Parham. And I'm going just to bring everyone's voices into the mix. We're going to just allow each of you to give a quick introduction to yourselves, maybe like 30 seconds to a minute or so, and then we'll launch into it. So Titi, we'll start off with you. Let's bring your voice into the mix.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you all as well to the entire panelists for the opportunity to be on this conversation today. My name is Titi Ikhile, and currently in my role, I am a director of lending and consulting with Working Solutions. We are a CDFI community development financial institution here in the Bay Area. We serve the 9 Bay Area counties. And in my role, I really, in terms of kind of my career, has been working in the lending space and also supporting businesses, a lot of kind of emphasis on women-owned and women, communities of color that I've served over the years and ingrained here in the Bay Area. And in my daily role, I really support our programs development and bring in a new set of eyes of just how we are reaching our communities. So I support our business development team, and also our lending deployment of capital, how we are deploying capital to the communities that we've prioritized, which are women, communities of colors, and low income. So the intersection of that is very critical to my daily work and to make sure that we're getting access in. And then the last is really consulting. We also provide consulting resources. And I also look at ways where we are helping build holistic entities and in these communities that we're prioritizing. And so our technical assistance, consultant supports also addresses that as well. And there, in terms of what I bring to this conversation is really just another eyes of just how we are navigating this changes and this the dynamics that we are talking about in terms of investors and the lending opportunities that are available, and making sure that we are addressing disruptive opportunities that we can bring to the table. We also look at the great disconnect that I've seen, but they're also in the midst of this. I think we have a small window of where we can insert new models that could be long lasting. So thank you.
Amazing, Titi. Thank you so much for that. Nicole, I'm going to hand over the mic to you.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Nicole Jarbo. I'm the founder and lead consultant at Good Bets Group, which is an organization that's really focused on helping folks who have a social impact interest get consulting around fundraising, securing funds, building relationships. And I'm also the founder of a small tech company where we help early stage freelancers and other folks who want to transition into work that they're really passionate about, get their start. And I think for the conversation, I'm really excited about how to think about the mindset shifts that we actually might need for this work to transition in a really creative and holistic and obviously equitable way. And so I'm excited to just hear everybody's perspectives and to be here. And also I'm based in Oakland.
Nicole, Trevor, let's bring your voice in.
Yeah, hi, my name is Trevor Parham. I'm Oakland resident, born and raised here, and I'm the co-founder and general partner at the Oakland Black Business Fund. We're a Black-led investment platform that focuses on providing capital, technical assistance, and growth strategy to Black-owned businesses across the country. And we also invest in businesses that, improve neighborhoods, create jobs, and also just provide strong financial returns as well. And so we just launched this effort in June, and we've already deployed quite a bit of capital and have raised some as well. And we're currently still sourcing a lot of other LP investors, as well as looking for other businesses to invest in our portfolio. I'm also the founder and owner of Oakstop, which is a co-working space and event meeting center in Oakland. And we have 3 locations now in the East Bay and have been in business since 2014. So we're approaching year 7 now of the business. So my work with both the Oakland Black Business Fund and Oakstop sort of go hand in hand, in that we also provide a lot of business support services through Oakstop and source a lot of Black entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color as well. And I also, just in terms of this particular panel, I think I'm also very much focused on the mindset shift and the definition of risk and what risk looks like when we talk about investing in communities of color.
Thanks so much, Trevor. On to you, Brian.
All right. Well, first of all, it's really an honor to be part of this panel. Thank you so much. So Brian Beckon, I'm with the firm of Cutting Edge Counsel, which is a law firm based here in Oakland. And we're better known for Cutting Edge Capital, which is our capital raising practice group. And essentially what we do, well, we do a lot of things, but our core area of focus is on democratizing the economy. In other words, using the securities laws, that is the laws that regulate the flow of capital, to really democratize the process in the sense of allowing everybody to invest. And we'll talk more about that when we get deeper into the discussion. But that's where I think we can be really impactful here is in helping communities invest in their own communities. And So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. So, I think, Nicole, you already queued it up with bringing in the point about the mindset shift. And I feel like that's a really great conversation, opener to the conversation. So I'm going to hand it back to you, and maybe you can bring us into that perspective.
Record, I just asked the question. I didn't really actually have an answer. But I think, again, like, I'm very, very curious about how we move, how we acknowledge that there needs to probably be an ideological and cultural shift in investing to more appropriately bring the creativity to actually supporting, folks who've been historically left out. And what I've seen, my background is really a nonprofit, and I had a small stint working as a philanthropic advisor to ultra high net worth individuals. So these folks were net worth 1.5 billion and up, and getting to know some of these folks in terms of their intentions, the legacy they wanted to set, where they wanted to invest money. If I'm being honest, I hit a lot of roadblocks in terms of the sort of the risk and the opportunity they saw in people who were different than them. And so it's just something like top of mind for me. I don't think I have an answer, but I'm very, very curious how folks think about it, because I don't think we can ignore that this is important and just jump to solutions. And I guess my biggest fear is that we're jumping to solutions instead of saying, hey, do you actually believe in this community? Do you actually believe that your investment is a good investment? And so back up to anyone who wants to talk about that, but I feel like I'm asking myself that question all the time.
Thanks, Nicole. Trevor, I think I'm going to pass it to you on that one, because you mentioned that you're very much in alignment with that question as well. So curious to hear what's alive for you.
Yeah. So, I think that when we talk about mindset shift, as Nicole mentioned, it's cultural and ideological, and where a lot of that stems from is what is structural, right? And the structures with which we, look at business and economics, investment and success, a lot of those structures are based on other ideologies that are not inclusive, let's say, and certainly exclude the viewpoints and values of particular communities. And so, what we end up with is a lot of structural exclusion that's based on the history of how deals have been done, how we define economic success, whether or not we factor in social impact to that, and also who those investments and who benefits from the performance of those investments, right? And so a big part of it is people looking at, right now, right? For instance, we have a lot of interest in sort of these hockey stick models from tech companies. And that's because you do have a lot of these ultra high net worth individuals that are interested simply in taking large amounts of money and making that work for them in the best way possible to grow that money and get, those types of returns. But they're not necessarily looking at the social impact as a metric for success, because it doesn't necessarily benefit them, number one, but also because when you look at the history of how a lot of these investments have worked, that hasn't been part of the historical story. So what folks are doing oftentimes is they're using history as a meter stick to be able to determine the success of their activities. And, given that we have these sort of structural biases in our history is always going to then tilt towards something that doesn't serve everyone, because the history itself is exclusive. So when we talk about making a mindset shift, it's not necessarily a matter of shifting the perspective of those who already have the resources and the ability to invest, but it's also shifting the landscape of who is investing, because that is not only going to sort of broaden the pool of the minds that are there doing the investment work, but it's also then going to change the perception of who's in power, who's able to make these decisions, and the value judgments that are placed on what success looks like and how you can configure success with multiple different bottom lines or multiple factors.
100%. Yeah, well said. And yeah.
Can I jump in here?
I was about to pass it to you, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's, thank you, Trevor. That's a super important point. And this is definitely one of those mindset issues that we need to get over. There's this assumption that investors are a class of people who are out there somewhere far away, usually in a gated enclave, and they drive their fancy cars and they live in their big house. Those are the investors out there. And the job of the rest of us is to try to find them and try to woo them and persuade them to invest in our communities. And that's a mindset that is really harmful because it taps into this idea that the people with the money and the power, they're the ones who know best, and they're the ones that should control our fates. But in reality, all of us can be investors. We all need to think of ourselves as investors. And we don't. We tend to think of ourselves as consumers or as workers, but not as investors. And so that's a big part of the mindset shift that we really need, that we have the power. Now, historically, have there been a lot of opportunities for regular folks to invest in our community? Well, no, but that's not because it can't happen. That's just because it hasn't happened. And so, a part of what we do at our firm is to help organizations, funds, and entrepreneurs do exactly that: raise capital from within their own community, including regular folks. So you're not putting your fate in the hand of some rich guy in some rich community somewhere far away. You can go out to your own community and raise capital from your community. Yes, everybody can invest in your business. And a big part of the reason for doing that isn't just to tap into more sources of capital for the entrepreneurs, but think about it sort of, turn it around a little bit and ask, if I'm successful and I'm profitable, where do I want my profits to go? Because wherever your investors are, that's where your profits are going to go. And if you want your profits, or if you're comfortable with your profits exiting your community and going off to some rich community somewhere far away, fine, take that capital from a rich community far away. But if you want your profits to circulate within your community and benefit your community, you've got to source your capital from within that community. And there are a lot of people out there who say it can't be done, but it can. This is just stuff that they don't teach you in law school. They don't teach you in business school, but it can be done. The laws do permit it. All right, I didn't mean to ramble there.
I feel the passion. We all feel the passion, Brian. It's good. It's good. And yeah, you're just underscoring the point of, that difference that democratizing capital investment can really make in, getting away from the typical shareholder primacy kind of dynamic and funneling the accruing the benefits of an enterprise to people who don't necessarily have a stake in a community. And yeah, there's so much richness in what you just shared. I'd love to dive in. Yeah. So Titi, what's alive for you?
Yeah. And I think just along the lines of the other panelists, it's really, I think if we go back to that core question about the intention and interest, the intentions is widespread, in terms of just, a wide spectrum of what those intentions could look like. And it might take a century for us to shift intentions of people, why they decide to pursue and, go, into like investment. But I believe that, part of the shift that we're seeing is just in terms of the dynamic of what truly an investor looks like is changing. And that model is constantly changing as it's more participatory, where all the other consumers are also part of that link, as Brian is also has also shared. And I think it's the key is who's sitting on the table. When I look at it, who's sitting on the table, and how, and what, now that the table is getting bigger, how much can we amplify our voices in a collective manner? I think we're doing a lot of work in silos, and so the more we can kind of start bringing this in an aggregate space and taking those as data points together, I think those are the things that are going to shift and get our voices amplified stronger. I see a lot of silo work. That is great work, but I think just the more that we're consolidating on that and bringing voices that really would shift will make those shifts happen faster. And not just on this season where I just see, there is a lot of interest. The interest is peaked because of all the media attention. How can we ride on this wave and also sustain it in terms of bringing in the key points that like Trevor had mentioned, of just a holistic approach of like what wealth building looks like, or what profit, what true profit looks like. That is not just the bottom line. They've heard this. They know what social impact looks like. But in terms of connecting the dots and saying these are the data points that shows that this risk that you're seeing is truly, there are other ways to assess it. But then what we're saying, this is what we've seen that has worked for us collectively. And start pushing that, connecting it with the media, connecting it with the education. I think we'll start seeing those mindset shift. Intentions might still not move, but if we can sustain interest, I think we'll start hopefully make a dent in the intentions eventually.
Definitely. And Titi, and Brian or Titi, maybe you want to speak to this, but just because each of you kind of have touched on it, but just, let's maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of the, emerging, new models around some of the things that we're talking about. Titi, I know that you've talked about, combining education and reparative capital. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, combining that with growth capital. And just to share briefly kind of my frame on that, I often bring kind of an ecological lens to some of this stuff. And I see, like, I have a background in regenerative agriculture, and I can see a lot of parallels between kind of that practice of that the conventional farming that we are kind of mining the land in an extractive versus actually building soil and regenerating a landscape. And that metaphor seems really apt to that building soil, to that piece of reparative capital, the whole mindset shift around that. So yeah, I'll hand it back to you, and Brian, maybe you want to chime in as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love that language, and I think that in itself speaks to what, in terms of that part of the mindset shift, because there's always a quick, funders have this urge for a quick turnaround of impact, and the expectations and that puts a lot of pressure on, the technical system, the providers to also feel like they have to continue to frame things in like a quick 1 year turnaround. What needs to really happen is really taking the model to embrace a holistic collaborative model, that looks at wealth from a perspective of financial wealth, knowledge wealth that they're going to invest, capacity wealth they're going to invest, network wealth that they're going to invest. And those are all the things that would create the systemic kind of holistic shift that from an entrepreneur, like I lean more from an entrepreneur building capacity framework, because that's the work that we do the most. Those are the things that will help make the shift that is needed to really not just provide capital because it's needed and we just check that off a list that a business has the capital that is needed, that is not going to get them to the wealthy, growth that is really the ultimate goal. And so I think really pushing the models that when we're asking, the ask has to be very specific. And I think we have the ears right now because there's a lot of media attention that is causing us to pause from being the one to define what that ask look like, but then giving the community the opportunity to define the ask. And this is where we really can push that. And this open window, I think, is what we really just have to just capitalize on quickly as we can.
Love it.
Yeah, and I guess I love that. Yeah, you're right. And the idea of reparative capital, that kind of illustrates the contrast between, let's just say take two hypothetical investment funds. One is a private fund that aggregates capital from wealthy investors who are trying to make 15%, 20% a year on their money, and they live far away, versus another fund that is a coming together of a community to invest in their own community. Now, one, the private fund with the wealthy investors, they have really only one goal, and that is to extract as much wealth as possible from the assets of the fund. There is nothing else they care about. And so, the decisions of that fund are going to be driven by the demands of those investors who don't care about this community, who just want to extract profits. On the other hand, you've got a fund that comprises people in the community. They're investing in order to improve their own community. Do they want to, earn a profit? Of course they do. But they also are going to have a lot of other motivations. And when those investors, collectively have a voice and govern the fund, that fund will then take that money and deploy it in the community in ways that is truly reparative. We're going to invest the money in the businesses that we need and in a non-extractive way that, yes, is profitable, because there's nothing wrong with making a profit, but is focused on profit as just one of a number of goals, and the total, sum effect of which will be a better community, more wealth building opportunities for everybody, and shared prosperity in a truly democratic way. So anyway, I think we can get to those funds. Those funds can be built. There just aren't enough of them.
Nicole, Trevor, what's coming up for you right now? Whoever wants to jump in.
A lot of things, I guess. I'm certainly familiar with Brian's work over at Cutting Edge Council and Cutting Edge Capital, and so I've been a big fan for a while and have even explored some of it for some of my own projects. And I think that when we look at how we make these changes, it's also a mindset shift for people who want to see the change, right? And I think that it's important that we look at ourselves as part of all the same society, and we're also then sort of subjected to a lot of the same mindset. And so instead of being in a position where we're asking questions and asking for support from the gatekeepers, I think that that's part of where we're going wrong, is that we're asking people whose minds are essentially more solidified and more calcified towards that direction. We should, instead of asking questions, we should be sort of providing the response to the community in terms of what they've already been asking for, right? And that's really the position we want to be in, is saying, if this is what community is saying they've been looking for, how do we then create that response and then provide that to the community? And, I think a lot of that, then just to sort of the point around the legal work, then it's a matter of looking at, well, what's really required to get these legal documents done, and what kind of work do we need to do, whether it's, getting the funds together to be able to cover the legal fees, and or is it getting more input from the community to get really clear on what types of investment structures they want. But, ultimately, we need to focus on putting the actual power in the hands of the community. And I think that what we're used to is having to go and knock on somebody's door and say, hello, excuse me, can you please provide us with power and privilege? And you keep knocking, and the door is never going to get open. So we spend all this time outside trying to talk to people about how to get in that door, when really the power is within all the people that are locked outside. So figure out what it looks like to conjure up the power within that community, and then go somewhere else and leave that door alone. And I think that that's really a lot of what we need to do. And if we have, I think a big part of it, and this is where folks like Brian and Cutting Edge Council come in, is that we're used to older structures where the sort of professional skill sets and the familiarity with the law lied in the same hands the people who we were trying to get to on the other side of that door. But now that that's not the case, and hasn't been the case for some time, and the education exists on the other side, and also the interest from people who want to drive that also exists, we need to focus on working with those people so that we're not constantly, beholden to asking for power transition from people who clearly have already demonstrated that that's not what they're in the business, literally, of doing.
Boom. Well said. Nicole, I want to check in.
Yeah. I wish I had spoken first after that. But something that I had written down when Brian was talking that Trevor brought up is this idea of power, right? And so this session is really about like funding parity, but I think we also have to talk really explicitly about power and decision-making parity as well, right? And so it's hard for me to really grasp that an organization would want to be more open to supporting the BIPOC community when I look at their organization, it doesn't necessarily reflect any folks from that community, right? And so do we have to keep going to folks who don't sort of historically have power and asking them for things and bringing it into our, glass-walled offices? Or can we actually open up, like Titi said, a seat at the table for those folks? And what does that look like? And something that she brought up that I think is another thing that stuck out to me is this idea of speed, right? Like, we know what's possible. Cool. Like, what are we doing to accelerate the pace of getting to that place? Right. And so that's something that I think about a lot. The structures, the systems, they're going to evolve and they're going to change as we learn more and we evolve our own understanding of this from any perspective that you're at. But I do think that the challenge that I'm thinking about is not just power, but speed. If we care, shouldn't we be moving faster on this? Right. And so that's something about what Trevor had said is power. And power and decision-making parity. That to me will open up more creative practices where we can be creative about how we utilize the law. We can be creative about, how we approach communities. And I would say the last thing that I wrote down when folks were speaking was, we know it's possible, but also what is happening, right? If we want to invest in communities that have been historically disadvantaged in some way, we'll just say economically for the sake of our conversation, I think we have to confront the reality, the brutal reality, that the net worth gap is significantly different. And so what can we really expect people to invest, right? If you're worried about what school your child may go to, if you're worried about putting groceries on the table or paying your rent, investing in a company, a small business in your community might be the farthest thing from your mind. So where is the compassion, the creativity, and the desire to make structural change from investors when we're approaching situations that are actually real life situations?
Yeah, Nicole, just to kind of on that, you mentioned of just the network gap. I think that's where really the power of the allyship really can be highlighted, because there are still, individuals of high net worth that have that strong positive intention that we, I think, to some degree, maybe their voice has been kind of silenced or they have not been amplified, and really being able to kind of tap into that, no matter how few that is. And I think something about Trevor mentioned about the governance of those funds, how could those structures from a legal perspective can open up and shifted where those voices, there are, policies that allow those to be much more of a heightened voice that they can, stand in those spaces, So, so it's real, and appreciate you kind of pointing that out.
This is bringing up for me just I think this is maybe like it'd be interesting to segue into some like leading models and actually like maybe get into some details around what's possible around what we're talking about. And I'm realizing that I was so excited for this panel and hearing from everyone. I actually never introduced myself, but just a presence. I'm a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. I produce our podcast, the Next Economy Now podcast. And I just want to presence, I'm learning a lot from folks in that context. I recently featured Clark Arrington from The Working World, in which we were talking about things like the seed commons, which is a newer model for community investment that is aligned. I think that is in alignment with what we're talking about. Also, investment clubs. That's kind of along the theme of like a Marcus Garvey inspired approach, touching on what Nicole said of people who, maybe, investing a very, like, whatever they can in community, but that's nested in community. Then we have funds, right? And that's the thing about having someone at the table. So, so on and so forth. But just like and maybe I'll hand this over to you, Brian. Can we like maybe talk about some of the models that we can look to that are in alignment with this conversation that we're having?
Yeah. And I can talk for hours about this, so I'll try not to veer too deeply into the legal wonky details. But there are several models that can work pretty easily with a true community funding approach to sourcing capital. And maybe if I can just sort of stop sort of as a sort of parenthetical here, because it was suggested that, but what about the fact that the lower income communities of color tend to have a lot of people that don't have much money to invest. And I think that's absolutely right. That is a concern. However, part of the problem is that when you are non-wealthy in America, if you're not an accredited investor, and that has a technical legal definition, it basically means you're not a millionaire. But if you're not one of those, you're not in that class of people, you have extremely few opportunities to invest. Basically, all you've got really is putting your money in a bank CD, which pays less than inflation. And so basically the way the system is designed right now, well, I shouldn't say the way the system is designed. The way the system has been implemented in the conventional wisdom is basically a system that penalizes the non-wealthy for saving money, because you can only generally invest in things that pay less than inflation, which means you lose money by investing if you are non-wealthy. The wealthy, on the other hand, make 10, 15% on their money. And so if they're wealthy, they can grow that wealth very rapidly. And, over a period of years, they can double, triple, quadruple their wealth. And so that naturally increases the wealth gap. We're rewarding the wealthy. We're penalizing the non-wealthy for investing. And so part of what we want to do is solve that problem by opening up those wealth to the non-wealthy. So you're no longer penalized for saving. If you've got $1,000 extra when you've paid all your bills, and sure, many of us don't, but there are many who do. If you've got $1,000, you should be able to put that into an investment that can actually do something meaningful for your community and earn a little profit that gets ahead of inflation. So anyway, I just want to respond to that point. But back to your question, Andrew, so what are some of the vehicles that allow you to do it? Well, I'll just list a few, and I could go into a lot more detail, maybe offline if anyone wants to reach out and talk about this. But there's a number of kinds of funds that can be set up to take in investment from your community, from the non-wealthy. And that's the really key thing here. These are not limited to the wealthy investor, the accredited investors. Everybody can invest in these. A real estate fund. You can set up a real estate fund that does a public offering within your state or whatever, or you can limit it to the community. You can limit it to the city of Oakland, but you can do a public offering that allows every member of the community to invest in this real estate fund that can then acquire, renovate and lease out property, and that can be done, at a modest profit and create wealth building opportunity. So real estate is one. You can set up a loan fund, and there are many examples of that. We've talked the Real People's Fund, the Revolutionary Economy for All Local People's Fund that Community Vision is managing. That's a great example of one that I've worked on. But there's many. RSF Social Finance is not local, but they're a good example of how a loan fund works. And so you can set that up to be very to make loans within a specific community, take in debt capital. That can be done publicly. There are some others. There are some, I won't go into a lot of detail about how these work, but There's something called a pooled income fund, which has sort of a charitable component, but a really solid wealth building component in the sense that it's basically kind of a lifetime annuity. And you can set up a holding company for that will acquire companies that maybe are at risk of going out of business, or whose owner is say, an aging, baby boomer who doesn't have family member to pass along the business to, and so that business is at risk of just shutting down when the owner retires. You can create a fund that will acquire those types of businesses, and that there is a securities strategy that allows for that. And again, I won't go into too much of the detail about how those securities laws work, or why only certain kinds of funds can work. But I'd be happy to talk with anyone about that in more detail offline. So and we're also, in our firm, we're also working on pushing the SEC to open up new opportunities to create new kinds of funds that can offer even more flexibility. So hopefully the laws in this area will be evolving in a way that can just really scale up this democratization of capital.
Love it. You went in, Brian. Yeah. What else do folks have to offer up in terms of like existing innovative models around this? I know Titi, you had spoken a little bit to that. Maybe I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I think those are really, really great models that we'll definitely love to check in with you on. From our lens, as we're working solutions, as a CDFI that has traditionally and still does work with a lot of bank fundings in terms of our investors and also foundations. I think for us, it's really reassessing how that we can kind of shift our ask in terms of kind of patient capital that allows us to deploy it in a way that matches the needs of the borrower and the long-term holistic growth of the business. And so for us, one of the things we're doing is really kind of dissecting our underwriting guidelines to really support those kind of holistic the deployment of capital that really would get it to the hands of the people that needs it and the amount that is needed, with the pairing of that with obviously the technical assistance that is needed. And so we are also kind of shifting in terms of disrupting how an underwriting has been done in the past. And, what are some of the credit challenges that tend to inhibit, the barriers that businesses can get to. So I think while the creative models of the community capital is very needed, and I believe it's going to accelerate, the traditional models also are changing, and that in itself, together, when those things are blended together, becomes a very powerful way. And when I can refer and kind of have a complementary, I can have a client to get capital from a community resource, and then have it, paired with a debt capital that has a patient capital attached to it, you really kind of start helping the clients really get that structure of a deal that makes more holistic approach that is non-extractive. So for us at Working Solutions, we really addressing our underwriting guidelines that really can serve our community better. So thank you.
And yeah, I want to give Trevor and Nicole an opportunity to chime in on this question before we jump into audience Q&A. But we can also jump right into that if you like.
I'll just say something briefly, in terms of some of the work that we're doing with the Oakland Black Business Fund. Two things. Number one, in addition to the notion of patient capital, we're also starting to look at leveraging flexible capital. So the idea of, leveraging a debt instrument, but also starting off with a conversation between investor and portfolio company, where there's essentially the option of pursuing either an equity conversion path or a debt repayment path. But then the portfolio company and the entrepreneur actually having some time throughout the life of that initial debt to figure out what's going to be best for them and communicate back and forth with the investor, such that the investor might be able to lend some expertise to the business to help them, take one path in the most sustainable way possible. And part of our work then as a management company is also working with those companies to help them not only just be sort of strong as a business, but also navigate that decision-making process. So you can get an investment, say in year one, and maybe it's by year 3 that you've actually made a decision with your investor on whether that's going to be an equity conversion or a debt repayment route. And then even still, in contrast to some other traditional convertible notes, at the point of maturity, then investor and entrepreneur renegotiate the repayment terms of that debt such that the business then even has a longer sort of timeline to repay that debt. So it ends up, being patient capital in that way, but there's also that flexibility sort of built into, which direction they want to choose and being able to decide over time. So that's one model that we're working with. And then another thing that we're considering as well is the idea of having a bunch of different types of investors kind of come into the fund, but then when it's a matter of returns, allowing the Black investors or the community investors or what have you to have a preferred return such that they actually get to pull their money out of the deal first, and then they can take that money, either put it back into the community and to other investments, or they're able to simply just pull it out first. And it helps to sort of align with what their economic agenda is. And so, those are just two things that we're currently looking at. And I think that there's, as Titi said, I think there's a lot of ways to sort of innovate on structures that are already there in ways that are configured to serve the community. But then there's also, the idea of also pursuing these newer things that are more focused on community and community investment.
So incredible. This conversation is so if we can segue. Nicole, before we segue, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? I see you pop back up.
Yeah, sure. I got kicked out for a second.
Oh, no.
I was going to just say, my experience is mostly in sort of early stage VC. And I think some of the things that are interesting to me are, organizations like a Indie VC, and I don't know if folks are familiar with them, where, the type of company they're looking to invest in is one that they believe is profitable and can sustain itself. It might not return, the 20x, 30x return, but what's embedded in their model is actually trying to make sure that companies stay alive. And so one of the things I was thinking about was sustainability, right? So as we reframe expectations, how are we raising the bar around what does sustainability look like for an organization rather than massive quick growth, right? Because if we're talking about wealth building, then folks actually need sustainable organizations where they can move around, become more profitable one year, maybe they're less profitable, and reinvest that capital into themselves. And so I think models like that are really interesting. There's another organization, Collab Capital. They're in Atlanta, and they function with a revenue share model in which they're not just actually providing capital, financial capital, but they're also very actively providing social capital, relationships, and other things that we actually know historically are missing from the opportunities for BIPOC entrepreneurs. So I think those are interesting. And then I think I have to talk about philanthropy because that's where I come from. So just very quickly, I would say that I think there are also opportunities as we think about who's allowed to invest or who has an opportunity to invest, and how do philanthropists come in and support this financial literacy opportunity, right? And I don't know if this is exactly sure, but I know someone on the panel probably knows if it's true that that accredited investor, regulations have actually been expanded recently. So I'm sure someone could answer that if that's true or not. And so if folks need things like FINRA certifications or need to meet other criteria, how can we get folks from the community in VC shops, in PE shops, so they would just, they would qualify without meeting that 200K a year threshold, right? And so those are things I think are interesting too, in terms of talking about the whole ecosystem, right? Changing the expectations of what's an investable company, number one. And then secondly, using that allyship that we talked about previously to help us invest in, providing this sort of groundswell opportunity for historically left out potential investors to start investing.
And you posed a really great question there, Brian.
I can answer that question if that's helpful. Yeah, so the SEC did just issue some new rules, adding some new categories to the definition of an accredited investor. And as I said earlier, basically it means someone who's got $1 million in assets, or someone mentioned, 200,000 of income. There are a couple of new categories. Someone who holds a Series 65, 82, I think, license. Anyway, you've got to have one of these securities licenses. If you have one of those licenses, you're now also considered accredited. On balance, I think it's a very incremental increase. It's not a wholesale expansion of the concept. Most of us are still not accredited. Still, even after those changes, certainly, 95% of Americans are not accredited. And so we still don't have those opportunities to invest in a broad range of things, and ironically, you'd think that people would be accredited, but who aren't. I mean, I'm a securities lawyer. I'm not an accredited investor. I advise people, I teach, I show people how to do these things. I do the regulatory work, but I can't invest in it. That's, it's a little crazy. But I guess what I would say about that is while it's good to expand the definition of accredited investor, our focus at our firm is really on those strategies where it doesn't matter if you're accredited. We want to deploy the strategies that are open to everybody, whether they're accredited or not. And we think that's a more effective way to go.
Yeah, so inviting still if anyone has any questions, echoing, I'm not sure if is it Risa? Gratitude to Brian for that. If there's any questions for folks coming up, or if you want to come up on screen, but otherwise we might just continue jamming on the conversation. I will just step back and allow y'all to continue to flow on this conversation. We're kind of wrapping up with the last 5 minutes here. So maybe kind of, Risa has a question. So I'm going to try and, you got some questions coming in here. So from Kate, has anyone seen models that use employee matching style programs to invite employees to invest with each paycheck? That's something
Well, okay. I guess I'll jump in. I'll say from a securities compliance perspective, sure, that can be done. It's there's a securities strategy for employee benefit plans that where employees can put away part of their money with every paycheck. So yes, that can be done. There is a lot of compliance work to be done because, generally speaking, plans like that typically trigger ERISA. That's the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which is a complicated set of laws. It goes beyond securities. It's more into the world of tax laws and fiduciary laws. So that's not my area of expertise. I can't tell you much about ERISA regulated plans. I can help you with the securities compliance. But yeah, I will say it can be done. I mean, generally speaking, if you're talking about, there's either the employee benefit plan, or you could set up some kind of a fund that basically allows anybody to just invest a little bit each month. And yeah, that could be done too, as long as it is able to do a public offering. And there are, the strategies that I listed earlier, those are all strategies that can be offered publicly. And so you can set those up for incremental monthly investments by non-accredited investors. So yes, it can be done. I don't see too many of those, but I know of a couple of examples.
And Kate, I'm just going to drop a resource in the chat here too, just so folks are aware. This isn't exactly to your question, but there's some really innovative stuff happening with something called the Next Egg Project, which is investing in solo 401ks. And I just put the link in the chat, so feel free to take a peek at that at your leisure. And let's bring in, is it Risa or Risa? Risa?
Can y'all hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. So I know there's only a few minutes left, but I'm from Community Vision, and we're piloting a new program. We're wrapping up year 1 of 3 years. It's called Arts Web, and it's a pilot project to support artists. And we're launching in Oakland with Zakia Harris as our arts business navigator. And we're putting together some amazing cohorts of creatives and providers. One of the things that's super exciting about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, all of your thoughts, maybe later offline, is that we're looking at using this pilot as a way to test and experiment some metrics of measuring, valuing, and potentially monetizing community cultural wealth. Because we recognize that artists are great examples of folks who have high cultural wealth and low financial wealth. So we're looking at creating a system where we can actually come up with metrics for things that are non-financial, but ways that artists bring wealth to the table and resources to the table. This is actually based on academic work from YASO around communities of color who show up in higher education institutions with these other types of non-financial resources, and looking at how we could potentially use those to drive more investments from like a risk, collateral, like, sort of alternate investment strategy. So we're super excited about this, and we're going to be hopefully piloting some of these metrics and ways of measuring alternate wealth and investment next year. And we'd love to hear all of your great minds on this project, and I'd love to connect with you all afterwards. So please, please, please reach out.
Muted. Love it. Thank you so much, Risa, for sharing that. And we're at the hour here. So I just want to take a moment to extend huge gratitude to all of our panelists and for all of you who have engaged in the chat. Thanks, Risa, for coming up on screen. And next on deck, we have in this incredible virtual conference, which I think many of us are still getting used to, the Expo booth exploration and networking. So feel free to jump into that as you're continuing to engage in some self-care. And just maybe want to do a quick round of, we might not have time for a quick round of last minute reflections, unfortunately, as I would have hoped. But again, just want to close with tremendous gratitude. This work, this topic is of critical importance. So thank you all for your great work in this. And thank you for this conversation.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.